Hello everyone, I'm very happy that you're with us today. Welcome to the annual Fulbright lecture, which is a very regular feature on the Diplomatic Academy's calendar. And as every year, it is done in cooperation with Fulbright Austria, the Austrian Fulbright alumni, and the US Embassy here in Vienna. And where it is still a normal year, then I would probably now extend a special welcome to Dr. Hermann Agis, who is in charge of Fulbright Austria, and I know that he joins us via Zoom and via Facebook. So a cordial welcome to you, even if it's online. And we have cooperated with the Fulbright Commission for a very, very long time, both in terms of professors and also in terms of student exchange. And we are, I don't want to say too much now, but we are checking out to extend our cooperation a little bit further. And we as Diplomatic Academy are very happy about that. A few words about our lecture today. It is entitled In Camps, Vietnamese Refugees, Asylum-Seekers and Repatriates. And the talk is given by this year's Fulbright professor, Jana Lipman. And I'm going to tell you just a few things about the talk and the book, because it's actually based on a book that she has recently published, and also about Jana. We probably see it unfolding, unfortunately, yet again in front of our eyes and in our very neighborhood. Wars generate all kinds of horrific consequences, especially humanitarian consequences. People try to flee from them. And Jana Lipman, in her research, looks at how refugees come to a space that is actually physically safe from a war in their country of origin, how they come to get recognition in the country to which they flee, and how perhaps at times even they assume agency in this new host country. And the case that she did, and she's a historian, so she does very meticulous research and archives. The case she looks at in the book are Vietnamese refugees, and she did a lot of research in Malaysia and Hong Kong and the Philippines and the United States and at the UNHCR in order to get at all the data that she needed for the book. And as the students, and I'm happy to see that quite a few of you are here today, as you know, Professor Lipman is with us for the first half of 2022, so January to June. And let me emphasize again, Jana, we're really, really happy to have you here. And I had lots and lots of super fantastic student feedback about you. And in her normal life, I should probably add that as well, she is professor of history at Tulane University in New Orleans. Writes books, articles on US foreign relations, on US immigration and labor history, and she's also a highly regarded op-ed writer. So for instance, if you're interested, you can check out a recent piece of hers on Guantanamo in the Washington Post. If I understand correctly, actually, Jana, your very first book was on Guantanamo long before people actually started thinking, writing, and everything about it. So without any further ado, Jana, I hand over to you. She's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we have ample time for discussion.
Thanks so much for having me here today and for such a warm introduction. And I cannot tell you how grateful I am to be here. In this moment when travel has been so precarious, this fellowship has been an intellectual and cultural gift, and I'm really trying to enjoy and learn from every minute of it. My talk is fairly serious, as you might imagine, but I wanted to begin with a moment of cultural exchange. The Fulbright is about cultural as well as intellectual exchange, and today is Carnival in New Orleans. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana, where Mardi Gras is very much part of the culture. All of my friends are out marching in the streets right now in costume. This is me and my family of Mardi Gras past. And so I want to just say happy Mardi Gras. I know it's fashioning here, but it really is an important day in New Orleans. I also would like to thank a few of my colleagues. I'd like to begin by thanking Fulbright Austria, and again, Dr. Hanan Agis, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing, but thank you. I would also like to thank my colleagues here at the Diplomatic Academy, Ambassador Brix and Dr. Kornprobst. I would also, and Sonia as well, thank you. I'd also like to thank all of my students, some of whom are here, and many of you who may be in my class next semester. I've been learning a great deal from all of you, and I've also had the opportunity to meet and work with students and colleagues at the University of Vienna, as well as at the IWM. And so I want to thank everyone for making this trip and exchange possible. As I said, I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, or maybe a little bit less, so we have time for Q&A. I'm really looking forward to your questions and your thoughts, and clearly many of these topics are in the news today. So again, Mardi Gras, happy Mardi Gras. Here we are, very much really celebrated in New Orleans. All right, but back to history. I'd like to provide some framing for this talk. And one of the things I did to prepare for today was to think about how and why this talk would hopefully resonate here in Austria and in Central Europe today, and not only be a talk about the past. So while my work takes place in the 1970s through the early 21st century, I want today's talk to resonate on multiple levels. First, this talk looks at refugee camps in Guam, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. These were places of first asylum, where Vietnamese, when they were fleeing Vietnam, would arrive before they knew they had a place for resettlement. And since coming to Vienna, I've learned that Austria sometimes served a similar function, particularly during the Cold War. I had the great fortune of meeting a graduate student, Sarah Knoll, who's getting her PhD at the University of Vienna, and she's investigating Austria's history as a place of first asylum right now. In her essay, Calling for Support, International Aid for Refugees in Austria During the Cold War, she's argued that Austria's relationship to refugees has been, quote, ambivalent, and that Austria often acts as a transit country. She writes, quote, by supporting refugees from the East, the Austrian government promotes the image of a liberal, democratic, and West-oriented country at the border of the Iron Curtain. This may resonate as I talk about places like Malaysia and Hong Kong that also acted as places of transit between flight and resettlement. Secondly, in my talk, I want to be discussing the 1979 and 1989 Geneva conferences. These were international meetings where the UNHCR, Western powers, and Southeast Asian countries sought to hammer out regional agreements to manage the large number of people leaving Vietnam. While each country had their own motive, the UNHCR's goal was to develop regional and international agreements. Again, I think that this may speak to questions raised in the present. While I'm here, I'm interested in exploring in greater depth the 2016 EU agreement with Turkey, which created a system of, quote, remote control, whereby the EU has provided 6 billion euros to Turkey to assist with Syrians there, but required Turkey to prevent future Syrian migration to the continent. The goal was clearly to keep Middle Eastern migrants in Turkey and outside the EU. On the one hand, this agreement has been heralded as a success for European cohesion and regional organization, creating some order and stopping some of the hundreds of thousands of Syrians who came through in 2015. On the other hand, human rights groups like Amnesty International have challenged this formula, arguing it has resulted in increased pushbacks and human rights abuses, particularly in camps in Greece, where thousands of Afghanis as well as other Middle Easterners remain in dreadful conditions. Here I've also had the opportunity to speak to some of my colleagues here in Vienna who are doing research on this topic. In the 1970s and 1980s, you'll see similar conflicts between the UNHCR and a desire for order and human rights activists. Thirdly, activism. In my work, I write about refugees protesting and engaging in multiple political forums. Often when we look at refugees in the media, refugees are presented as passive, as needing aid, which is accurate, but as somehow apolitical, as not having agency, and in sometimes not even being political, in some ways being pathetic, abject, helpless. In my work, I like to focus on refugee political activism, and again, we continue to see this today, whether it's hunger strikes among Syrian refugees in islands in Greece. Where I live in Louisiana, there are asylum seekers in jails throughout Louisiana who have conducted hunger strikes. And in the UAE, there have been protests by Afghans who want to be resettled in the United States. Finally, Ukraine. Obviously, this is on all of our minds, I imagine. I've been watching the news nonstop for the last several days. I imagine you have been as well. I also want to be clear, I'm not an expert in Ukraine or Central Europe, and so I want to tread carefully. However, obviously, we are seeing hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians cross into borders as we speak. These raise all sorts of questions for the present. What will this mean for Poland, for Slovakia, for Hungary? Right now, most of the Ukrainians, as far as I can read in the news, are staying with friends and family in individuals' homes in these countries. But will there be camps as well? Will people stay for short periods of time or long? Will they be allowed to integrate? Right now, I've read that the EU is offering, Ukrainians have 90 days in the EU, and there's been talk of extending up to 3-year residency for Ukrainians who come to the EU. Will there be a time limit after that? What will happen after those times pass? Who will get refugee status and why? So, with that, also, will the United States admit Ukrainians and refugees in higher numbers than the U.S. is currently planning to admit refugees? Where is the U.S. in this story? So, with that in mind, those are all different ways I hope that this talk will still matter to you right now, even if I'm talking about events that are almost 50 years ago. So, to my historical research. As many of you may know, in 1975, the North Vietnamese Army marched south, and the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese military and government collapsed far more quickly than the U.S. anticipated. And this becomes known as the Fall of Saigon. In the wake of this government collapse, approximately 125,000 Vietnamese left the country. This is a very famous image of Vietnamese trying to get into a helicopter that was leaving. Yet, of course, helicopters did not go directly to the United States. Also, those who left by boats, the boats did not go directly to the United States. Instead, what most people do not know is that most of these Vietnamese were sent to Guam, which is on the far eastern part of the map, which is located 4,000 miles from Hawaii and almost 6,000 miles from California. And Guam was the primary staging area in 1975. And again, it's useful to think about these places in between that we might not otherwise pay attention to. By mid-May, 100,000 Vietnamese were in Guam, and this doubled Guam's population. Those of you may not know that Guam became a U.S. territory, or I would even say a U.S. colony, in 1898 at the end of the Spanish-American War. Like Puerto Rico, Guam has no voting rights in Congress, and they cannot vote for U.S. president. So Guam very much has a colonial-like status in the United States. However, it does have massive U.S. military bases, and so when the U.S. brought all of the Vietnamese to Guam, the Guam government had no say over this matter. Okay? The U.S. could unilaterally bring them to Guam. Now, most of the Vietnamese on Guam were quickly processed to the United States. The US did not have the wherewithal to screen these Vietnamese, who was who, what their political identities might have been. However, they did not come as refugees. Instead, President Gerald Ford gave them the political status of parolee. The US did not have a refugee law until 1980, so Vietnamese were admitted under executive authority because the president saw them as Cold War allies deserving of US aid, but they are outside normal immigration channels. And this is the story that I knew, I think that most people who think about Vietnamese refugees had known. But during my research, I came across photos that I found remarkable, that changed what I thought I knew about Vietnamese refugees in places like Guam. Images like this one, of Vietnamese having their heads shaved in hunger strikes and marching with pictures of Ho Chi Minh on a US naval base in Guam. These men and some women wanted to go back to Vietnam. They did not want to be resettled in the United States. Rather, they wanted to be repatriated. Who were these men and women? Why would anyone do such a thing? How did they go against this expectation of all of the Vietnamese wanting to resettle in the United States? Now, most of them, about 80% of the repatriates, were South Vietnamese military personnel. But most of them belonged to the military's lowest echelons. They were overwhelmingly single men. Most of them were in the South Vietnamese Navy. So imagine you're in the South Vietnamese Navy, you're on a ship, Saigon falls, and your commander says, we're not bringing this ship back to Saigon because we don't want to essentially surrender to the North Vietnamese. The ship then would go to the Philippines and then to Guam, and the men on that ship all of a sudden had become refugees. These are the young men who in general wanted to return to Vietnam because they did not feel that they themselves had chosen to leave. And these Vietnamese wanted to go back, and they began to protest. And they explicitly escalated their protests, appealing to people in Guam and the United States. They began to have walk-offs off the camp and have protests in the center of Guam. In one instance, 200 individuals marched with their hands tied behind their backs to symbolize their imprisonment, and they engaged in hunger strikes. Later, they even engaged in arson, burning down buildings in the refugee camp, demanding to go back to Vietnam. And so as you can imagine, the Guam government was concerned what to do with this group of people who wanted to go back. And remember, Guam has very little wiggle room. The Guam government is entirely dependent on the United States. And so the governor of Guam tried to do his best. He wanted a solution to remove the repatriates from Guam and fast. Members of the Guam legislature were arguing for the removal of the Vietnamese to the even more remote Wake Island. And there was growing frustration at the administration's impotence. But finally, there was a solution suggested. Give the repatriates a ship. Allow them to go back under their own power. And many of the repatriates very quickly celebrated this idea. So in order to prevent expected escalation of protests, President Ford stepped forward and improved the use of the Tong Tin 1, a Vietnamese ship which had been initially used to carry refugees to Guam, to now go back to Vietnam with the repatriates. In total, 1,546 Vietnamese returned to Vietnam on this ship. However, quite tragically, when the ship arrived in South Vietnam in October, the government imprisoned the repatriates. Never making the international news, most of the repatriates were easily disappeared into the network of re-education camps mapping southern Vietnam. The ship captain was a man named Tran Dinh Tru. He had been in the South Vietnamese Navy. He returned because his wife was not able to escape in 1975, and he wanted to be reunited with his family. Tran Dinh Tru was then imprisoned in a re-education camp for 12 to 13 years in Vietnam. It was a forced labor camp. And when he was finally released, he came to the United States under a very special refugee program for former political prisoners. And he wrote his memoir about going to Guam choosing to go back to Vietnam, and then suffering in the re-education camps. And I had the good fortune to find this in Vietnamese in the Library of Congress, and I worked with my colleague Bác Hoa Tran to translate it into English. I should add I do not speak Vietnamese, so I largely was working as an editor and working on the English. What to take of this story? I'd like to make 2 or 3 key points. One, thinking about US policy, that the Vietnamese legally were not refugees but parolees as they entered the United States. Thinking about the multiple categories governments give to people as they're thinking about their immigration status. Secondly, thinking about that refugees and people who claim refugee identities don't always fall into the easy Cold War binaries we expect: communist, anti-communist, right and left. Often people had multiple identities or changed over time or did not fit into neat categories that the United States had prescribed for them. Thirdly, thinking about Guam as a place in between, how much power Guam had or did not. And finally, the role of refugee activism and protest. Next case study. Please bear with me as we move in time and space. We're going to go down to Malaysia. For those of you who may not be familiar with Southeast Asia, Malaysia has 2 parts: peninsular Malaysia, where you see Kuala Lumpur, eastern Malaysia, where you see Sabah. And if you can see where Ho Chi Minh City is, or Saigon, if you go straight south, you hit northeastern Malaysia. So in the late 70s, when large numbers of Vietnamese began leaving southern Vietnam, this is the era of the quote-unquote boat people, the vast majority hit Malaysia. So Malaysia is the country that in many ways has to cope with the greatest number of incoming Vietnamese. And unlike in Guam, for the most part, the Vietnamese in the camps in Malaysia did not protest. They feared it could jeopardize their chances for resettlement. And so while the camps were plagued by rats, overcrowding, and sanitation problems, for the most part, people waited. At this point, the Vietnamese, again, did not all have legal refugee status, although the UNHCR and the US generally assumed them to be refugees. But Malaysia did not. Malaysia categorized the incoming Vietnamese as illegal immigrants, in fact, VIIs, Vietnamese illegal immigrants, and was trying to cope with them. And so while the US saw them as refugees, anti-communists, deserving to be saved, Malaysia did not. And Malaysia saw many of these incoming Vietnamese as potentially an invading force that might destabilize Malaysia. This began in a very violent, in many ways, policies, or I would say contradictory policy, where on the one hand, Malaysia took in more Vietnamese than any other Southeast Asian country. There's a great amount of support, particularly from the Red Crescent Society, providing humanitarian aid. But Malaysia also began a policy of pushbacks, pushing Vietnamese back to sea. Why was this? There are many reasons. One is that there was this concern that the Vietnamese themselves might be communists coming to infiltrate Malaysia. Malaysia journalists noted the high number of Chinese Vietnamese who are an ethnic minority within Malaysia. This fear of the Vietnamese as infiltrators or secret agents was particularly apparent in the Malay language media at the time. And I think this resonates with the fear of Syrians and Afghans in the sense that not only are they maybe fleeing terrorism, but they themselves might be terrorists. And we can see this in Malaysia, this fear of the Vietnamese. In Mastika, a Malay language magazine, a reporter explained that Malaysia should stop accepting the Vietnamese because they were fleeing a communist country. So while the US saw that as a reason to accept them, Malaysia saw that as a reason to be suspicious. The Far Eastern Economic Review reported that the government feared Hanoi was intentionally planting agents among the so-called refugees. A Malaysian letter to the editor put it succinctly: the communist underground in peninsular Malaysia, led by Chin Peng, was and still is dominated by the Chinese. The idea that the Chinese are communist is embodied in the mind of Malays. They form an equation: Chinese equals communists, Chinese equals refugees, therefore refugees equals communists. The government argued for constant vigilance, and it even suggested that many of those who were running away had supported the Viet Cong. Another English-language newspaper suggested that the Vietnamese could be communist agents. Camps are now scattered on beaches up the whole length of the coast. Any reasonably resourceful communist agent could slip out of such a camp. There's no guarantee that some have not already done so. I have several more examples as well. The key point is this sort of fear, and also the specificity of Malaysia. Malaysia has a multiracial demographics, but has large numbers of Malay and Chinese, as well as South Asians and other different groups as well. But there is a concern among the Malay government that if there were too many Chinese, that this would upset the, quote, racial balance. So also the Vietnamese were seen as Chinese Vietnamese and as potentially destabilizing for that reason as well. In other words, Malaysia's perception of the Vietnamese was at odds with the American and European representations of the boat people. This was combined with a general nationalist xenophobia, which I think we see in most countries. And still the specific regional context, I think, changes our perception that all Vietnamese were welcomed as, quote, anti-communist refugees. So, as I said, the Malaysians, though, do take in tens of thousands of Vietnamese, but they're worried that they're going to be in the camps for long periods of time, that they will not be resettled, and Malaysia will, quote, be stuck with the boat people. This will lead to Prime Minister Mohammed Mahathir's infamous comments. He said in 1979, "Our patience is fully extended. If 500,000 immigrants tried to land in Britain, they might probably shoot them. We've already been accused by Newsweek of shooting illegal immigrants, so we might as well get done with it and justify their accusation. We are being nice and humane, but what do we get? Nothing, so why bother?" This got published in the English language and the international media that, quote, shoot on sight legislation was forthcoming. Now, Mahathir's colleagues tried to sort of roll back this rhetoric and said he meant shoo, not shoot, but obviously the message was clear. There was also pressure from Great Britain because there are issues in Hong Kong, as well as in Thailand and Indonesia. So in 1979, the UNHCR sponsored the first major conference on Indo-Chinese refugees, which brought together first asylum countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines, Vietnam, and resettlement countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, as well as other European countries and Japan, to try to broker a regional agreement to create order and, quote, end the refugee crisis. It had a few different positions. First, and most importantly for the UNHCR, it upheld the principle of first asylum. The UNHCR wanted to stop pushbacks. It did not want countries sending boats back to sea. So the major compromise by countries like Malaysia is they would take incoming Vietnamese and they would not push the boats back. However, what did those countries like Malaysia get in return? The promise by the UNHCR that all of the Vietnamese would be resettled elsewhere, that they would not be, quote, stuck in Malaysia or Indonesia or the Philippines, etc. And so the Western countries, largely, although not exclusively, the US, Australia, Canada, and Western Europe, West Germany actually takes a fair number of people, as does Norway, that they would resettle Vietnamese and they would not be left in Vietnam. In addition, the Western countries will pay a great deal of money to make sure this program was working. And finally, they initiate a program called the Orderly Departure Program, which would allow for Vietnamese to apply for immigration status from within Vietnam. So this is the main agreement from the 70s. So main takeaways. One, it's important to think about countries in between. Malaysia had a very specific set of domestic political pressures. They had a competition between Malay and Chinese Malaysians. They had a fear of communism within Malaysia. And these pressures affected Malaysia's response to the incoming Vietnamese. Secondly, we also see the role of international cooperation with compromises and give and take, but an attempt to come out with a regional cooperative formula. All right, my last case study, Hong Kong. Between 1979, first of all, Hong Kong in this time period is a British colony, all right? You have to see Hong Kong is still under British colonial rule. Between 1979 and 1988, Hong Kong accepted tens of thousands of Vietnamese according to the 1979 convention, and Hong Kong was very proud as a British colony of having no pushbacks. Hong Kong said we never pushed any boats away. And all of the Vietnamese coming in were receiving first asylum. However, as the 80s progressed, the United States, along with other Western countries, were taking fewer Vietnamese in. In addition, in Hong Kong, I don't have the map here, I was going to do this, but as I showed you from Vietnam to going south to get to Malaysia, from northern Vietnam you get to Hong Kong. This meant more of the Vietnamese going to Hong Kong were from northern Vietnam. The US did not see them as refugees because these were not people who had fought with the South Vietnamese army during the war. And so this is coming to bear. We're having more and more Vietnamese essentially stuck as long stayers in Hong Kong. In addition, Hong Kong is a couple, again, specific political sort of pressures that are specific to Hong Kong. First, the Vietnamese all got first asylum. This was absolutely in opposition to what happened if you were Chinese and you crossed into Hong Kong. Chinese were seen as illegal border crossers and were very quickly deported back to China, while Vietnamese coming in on boats were allowed to stay as refugees. This meant that Hong Kong Chinese soon grew to resent the Vietnamese because they said, why should Vietnamese get refugee status and resettlement when Chinese, my uncle or my neighbors from other parts of China, are very quickly deported? Secondly, Hong Kong was looking at 1997, and this was a moment where Hong Kong is being negotiated from British to Chinese sovereignty, and many in Hong Kong were worried that they too might become refugees in 1997 with the imposition of Chinese sovereignty. So again, Hong Kong Chinese were very ambivalent about this sort of what they saw as special treatment for the Vietnamese. So in 1988, and this is just an image from a Vietnamese artist within the camps, this sort of an image. In 1988, Hong Kong, there's a new influx of Vietnamese, and the Hong Kong government said, we're not going to abide by that 1979 agreement anymore. We're not going to say that all Vietnamese coming in are refugees. Rather, we're going to begin individual asylum hearings. And instead of saying all Vietnamese can be resettled in the West, we are going to interview everyone one by one, and those who can prove that they face political persecution will be resettled in the West, but those who only need an economic sort of a better life or who are economic migrants, they will be screened out and they will be repatriated back to Vietnam. Now, at first, the UNHCR was very hesitant about this. This was controversial. The UNHCR said, our job is to protect refugees. But soon the UNHCR did a 180. And the UNHCR said, look, it's been 15 years since the end of the war. Things have changed, and we need a regional agreement. And this will become the 1989 Comprehensive Plan of Action. It brings the same players to the table: Vietnam, the US, the Southeast Asian countries, Western Europe. But now there's a new change. This keeps first asylum. Everyone can still get first asylum. We are not going to push people back off to sea. If you show up on a boat, you will be given shelter, although in Hong Kong it may be in a detention-like facility, as in many of the other Southeast Asian countries as well. But rather than getting resettlement, you will have an individual asylum hearing and you will be screened. If you are screened in, resettlement. Screened out, you'll be repatriated, or what we might see as deported. And I think, again, this resonates when we think about, I know today there are Afghans who have asylum claims, are facing deportation here in Europe. In the United States, large numbers of asylum seekers, particularly from Central America, but not exclusively, also are screened out and face deportation in the United States. This idea of individual asylum hearing, I think, is very familiar to those of us in the 21st century. But for Vietnamese coming into Hong Kong, this was a drastic change in their status, and again they began to protest. They protested in multiple ways. They protested through legal cases. They brought legal claims to the Hong Kong courts. And they argued that the asylum processes were unfair and violated their due process. And human rights lawyers in Hong Kong and the United States took their claims and brought them through the Hong Kong judicial system. In 1991, the Hong Kong judge, Barry Mortimer, decided in favor of the Vietnamese test plaintiff that the individual did not receive his due process. However, the court also affirmed that the screening procedure in principle was fair. This meant that the Vietnamese challenging these screenings were eligible for second hearings, but were not granted automatic refugee status. In other words, the screenings were allowed, but there were more due process protections built into the interviews. The human rights lawyer said this was a victory. Quote, a decision was technical and narrow, legally speaking, but politically it will have an enormous consequence. But the Hong Kong security officer said it was a vindication of Hong Kong screening procedures. This will then lead to a great deal of, again, protest within Hong Kong. Vietnamese in the camps began to mobilize against these repatriations. So if in Guam we saw people protesting to be repatriated, here we see people protesting against repatriation. And these became extremely physical and looked like prisoner protests throughout the world. There were hunger strikes, self-mutilation, suicide attempts, and these we can see here in dramatic images taken in Hong Kong in the 1990s. A Vietnamese woman who arrived in Hong Kong in 1988 when she was 10 years old remembered her own fear of tear gas and raids against protests within the camps she witnessed. She said the political contest that was raging within the camps, including lengthy hunger strikes that even resulted in individual deaths. She said the Hong Kong press regularly wrote of riots, but she rejected this language as delegitimizing. She said they called our demonstrations or protests riots. Still, she said, there were loudspeakers and pressure trying to get the Vietnamese to voluntarily repatriate. The idea was that with the pressure, people would go back on their own accord and not have to be forced. Wherever you go, you hear things like, you should go back. If not, you will be forced to go back. There are announcements almost every day. So you go around the camp. It's small, it's crowded. You're mentally stressed due to the prolonged detention. You hear this all the time. And then you see people being carried onto big lorries, transferred to another camp for forced repatriation. This young woman spoke of protest with some pride, but she also observed these hunger strikes and self-mutilations, which she admitted were scary and unsettling to witness. And this is, again, another artistic rendition, and the flag flown is the South Vietnamese flag, again, trying to identify with South Vietnam and its anti-communist past. But in the end, Hong Kong repatriated approximately 60,000 Vietnamese back to Vietnam in the 1990s, and throughout Southeast Asia, about 100,000 Vietnamese were repatriated back to Vietnam. In July of 1997, only roughly 2,000 Vietnamese remained in Hong Kong. Ultimately, some were repatriated, while others remained stateless in Hong Kong, often without legal status. So where does this leave us for today? I hope this work will have larger implications for our understandings of refugees, refugee camps, and international relations. First, who gets to be a refugee is a matter of politics. I did not actually talk about the UNHCR's 1951 definition of refugee status. I can do that during Q&A. But refugee status historically has been politically structured. It depends when and where someone is leaving, depends when and where someone arrives. It depends on all sorts of political factors in between. And so if a Vietnamese left in 75, 79, 88, 91, their political status would be different, and they would face a different bar of proof that they would have to show whether or not they would be granted refugee status or not. I don't know how this is going to be playing out. Right now, all Ukrainians who are leaving are being welcomed into the EU. But there have also been articles about why this immediate response when Syrians and Afghans faced a very different type of response within EU countries or those from sub-Saharan Africa. How long will European countries welcome Ukrainians? Will this change over time? These are questions which we should ask, but we should see that it's historically grounded, and we should assume that it will change at some point, right? Right now we are in a moment of crisis, but we need to recognize that this is politically bound. Secondly, we need to think about host countries and asylum sites. Not only does the time matter, but the place. Guam, Malaysia, and Hong Kong all had very different politics and reasons for accepting Vietnamese, having ambivalent relationships to the Vietnamese, or deciding they were not going to have Vietnamese refugees any longer. Today, I think about, in my case, in the United States, the role of Mexico. What are Mexico's domestic politics? Mexico has been hosting thousands of migrants during the Trump administration and even now during the Biden administration to some extent. If we think about the Middle East, what's been the politics of Turkey, of Jordan, of Lebanon for thinking about Syrians in the 21st century as well? And today, how might Hungary's politics versus Poland's versus Austria's determine how Ukrainians may be treated or what types of political situations they may encounter? Finally, activism. Again, refugees are not passive. The images that we often see and that are repeated throughout the media and often used, in fact, to generate money, which is generally a good cause, generally downplay refugee activism and political desires for change either in their conditions or in their home countries. Again, I like to emphasize activism. Again, in my case in Louisiana, there are large numbers of asylum seekers that have been held in Louisiana jails. There have been hunger strikes. There are also, in the case of the Vietnamese, there have been deportations recently of Cambodians and Vietnamese in the United States, and we see diasporic activism in the US against these deportations. I hope this work will have larger implications for the histories of refugees and refugee camps broadly construed. Vietnamese men and women were far from the only population to find themselves in between the legacies of empire and war. As I've mentioned, these concerns continue to echo in Europe with conflicts in Syria, Afghanistan, sub-Saharan Africa, and now Ukraine. And as a result, rather than seeming anomalous or anachronistic, debates over refugee camps, sovereignty, and repatriation foreshadow the convergence between military and migrant operations in the 20th and 21st centuries. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Jana, thanks a lot for your talk. It was super interesting and very, very, very detailed. And we're going to move now to questions and answers. And I'll try to do that both online and in person. But I think we're going to start with in person, and I'll group 3 questions at a time because you're usually a very active audience. So whoever wants to go first, raise your hand. Yes.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your talk. My name is Klaas Kreuzer. I'm a MICE 2 student. And I was wondering, with last year's downfall of the Western presence in Afghanistan, I feel like there was a lot of guilt in the Western community for not being able to protect people who worked with them. And this caused a very short period where people were actually trying to help people getting out of Afghanistan. And I was wondering, did we see similar feelings in the US population after the fall of Saigon, where the US public pressured the government in getting people out of the US which worked with them?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
That's a great question.
And then, yeah.
Thank you. I want to thank you as well for the talk. My name is Katrina Funkrans. I'm also a MICE 2 student here at the DA. And the topics you touched upon really reminded me of the situation in Australia and the camps there. And I was wondering if you think that the episode with Djokovic, where he couldn't enter the country and was treated similarly to those people. If you think that this helps the protests and the raising awareness that has been going on for 10 years, I think, or do you think it's just one point in time and everybody's going to forget about it in, I don't know, 6 months or something?
Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm also a MICE 2 student here at the GA, and again, thanks a lot for your talk. And I was just wondering, so the Low Ocean Civil War was associated with the Vietnam War, and I do believe that, at least from what I've read, that most of them fled to Thailand, and I was just wondering if they kind of faced this, like a similar fate as the Vietnamese refugees. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great questions. Is this working?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you so much. Those are really, really good questions. I'm just going to go in the order that you gave them. So I think that you're right, and there are lots of articles in the newspaper in August comparing the fall of Saigon and the end of the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. There are those two images of the helicopters that were often juxtaposed to each other. I would say several things, and I'm still thinking through it. I don't want to make just an easy comparison. The helicopters almost make it too easy to say that they're the same. But there are similarities, and I think in some ways we see more ambivalence on the part of the United States, even though there is a fair deal, I think, of guilt, particularly among the U.S. government officers who worked closely with people in both countries. In 1975, it was really the U.S. government under the Ford administration who created the mechanism to allow Vietnamese to enter. There wasn't a huge amount of support in the United States for that. I forget what the percentages are, but it was at least 50% of the country was not welcoming to the Vietnamese who were entering in 1975. There also were many people who were. So, I mean, there was a mixed feeling. And part of the reason why Americans were not supportive of the Vietnamese coming in 75, again, was a misreading of the Vietnamese. It was a sense that these were the enemy. I have letters to the editor of veterans who wrote, wait a second, I fought in Vietnam for a year only to have Vietnamese come here now, not registering that the Vietnamese coming were the allies of the United States, right? There's also a long-standing anti-Asian history in the United States, particularly with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so there was a great deal of animosity against Vietnamese as Asian migrants as well. And they were often coded as, quote, the enemy, even when they were the US ally. That said, the federal government was very proactive, and the government under the Ford administration, I would argue, used the refugee operation to try to dull the sense of loss with the Vietnam War. And I've written about this. It's very clear that the US lost the Vietnam War, but by bringing the Vietnamese to the United States, there's a quote I found in a document that something good has come of it, right? The attempt to demonstrate that there was a way that the US had a successful humanitarian mission that tried to almost rebrand the US military. So I think that we have a very different sense of the US military there. In Afghanistan, again, I think it's a very mixed opinion in the United States. There in some ways was a lot of support for letting in Afghanis. Lots of Americans have volunteered to help resettle Afghanis. On the other hand, the US has not admitted all of that many. I believe, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, but I believe there's still Afghanis on US military bases in the US right now who have not yet been resettled, who are waiting for screening processes and to be actually resettled. And I would say that the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of xenophobia, anti-refugee sentiment in the US. And so despite the fact there is a contingent supporting Afghan resettlement, the numbers have been more modest than one might anticipate. So that's for the Afghanis. For the questions of Australia, who was asked about Australia? Thank you. I actually was super interested in Australia. Not an expert. But I do think that Australia's policy of using, I'm going to say the name of the island wrong. I'm getting it wrong. I'm not going to try to say it right now. But there's an island where where Australia sends asylum seekers, which is in Papua New Guinea, which is very isolated, and is again part of this policy of trying to keep refugees outside the country, right? How can we keep them away? If they're in Australia, they'll have access to rights, to lawyers, to all sorts of activist networks. If they are isolated on an island, they're far more out of sight. It's much harder to get political attention. And in Australia as well, I think we see this. I didn't go far into this in my cases, but in Malaysia, these refugee camps were often in peripheral spaces, on islands. Even in Hong Kong, which is an archipelago of islands, the refugee camps were often on islands farther away from the main population centers. Not always, but sometimes. And I think that Australia has a very, I would say, very strict policy. It's been very aggressive about keeping asylum seekers away from Australia to prevent them from having rights. And we can see, I would say, the origins of that in some of these stories in Vietnam. And then Laos, thank you. I do not write enough about Laos and Cambodia. This is a huge lacuna in my research. You are absolutely right. In Laos and Cambodia, there's massive displacement of persons, both during and after the war. Unlike the Vietnamese who left by boat, Laotians were far more likely to go by land and to Thailand. There are huge numbers of refugee camps in the Thai border. These become very much intertwined with the ongoing war in Cambodia. In Laos, there are also repatriations. Some of the earlier repatriation agreements were actually about Laos. Large numbers of Laotians, in fact, do go back to Laos in the 1980s and early 1990s. In one of my interviews with a UNHCR officer, he talked about Laos being a template for the CPA. He felt that the agreement for Laotians to return sort of set the groundwork for other repatriations. However, other Laotians do come to the United States. Disproportionately, these were Laotians and Hmong as well, who had worked with the CIA. And these were were seen as humanitarian programs for individuals who worked directly with the US government. And in the US, the largest resettlement, I believe, is in California and in Minnesota. So that's just some of, but you're correct. And the politics in the Thai border are equally complicated and are very much about the ongoing wars and the Vietnamese war with Cambodia, which is often called the Third Indochina War, that takes place from roughly 1975 to 1979.
Jana, thanks very much. And then we're ready for the next round. Sandra in the back, Ireland.
Hello, thank you for being here today. My name is Ireland Meckley. I'm also a MICE 2 student. I was wondering what your opinion is on countries publicly stating that they would like to stop accepting asylum applications. Last year, Denmark stated that they have a goal of receiving 0 asylum applications in the coming years. So I was wondering what your opinion is on that.
Okay. Do you want to take one more question?
2 more.
Oh, sure, yeah, of course.
Yeah, Sandra.
Thank you. I'm Sandra, and you spoke about the protests also in refugee camps, and that also some of them were effective. Are there any factors that make such uprisings more likely to be successful, or are they even? Is this like an isolated case, or is there any like indication on that?
Thank you. And then the lady in the front was the fastest, and we're going to go on with the next batch. Yes, in the front.
Good evening. Thank you again for your very informative presentation. My name is Mai. I'm not a student here or anymore. I am just a Vietnamese interested in Vietnamese history. And being a Vietnamese myself, I feel a little ashamed that I know very little about this topic. And I'm very grateful to have this chance to listen to you today. I have many questions, but I ask just one. Do you know if the reaction of the Vietnamese government, how they received the Vietnamese who were deported after the Geneva Conference in 1989?
That's a great question.
Because this we never heard in Vietnam. Thank you.
Those are great questions again. Thank you so much. So the first about the accepting asylum. So these are my own politics, but I would be very opposed to that. I mean, I think that the ability to make asylum cases is very important and is thinking about both the UNHCR convention. But I can talk to you a little bit about the US case, which I know much more. The US did not have refugee law until 1980. Before 1980, refugee law was really ad hoc, and it was largely based on the president and anti-communist politics. So Hungarians are allowed to enter as refugees, Cubans are allowed to enter as refugees, and then Vietnamese are allowed to enter as refugees. And in 1980, Congress essentially said, enough. There needs to be more order, and we need to have legislation, and they passed the 1980 refugee law in the United States. When it comes to your question, the 1980 refugee law had two pieces to it. One was for refugees. Those were imagined to be people outside the United States in refugee camps who would be admitted into the United States. But it included a provision for asylum seekers, for people in the United States to claim asylum, that they were facing persecution even though they were already in the United States. This was new. And I would suggest to you that the writers of the law did not anticipate that in 2021 there would be more asylum seekers than there were refugees, that there would be more people in the US claiming the asylum and wanting asylum status than there were people who were actually being admitted as refugees. In general, asylum cases, at least in the US, it's very arbitrary often who gets asylum and who does not. There's massive inconsistencies across judges and courts. And in the United States, there's a growing trend where more and more cases are rejected. Again, if you are from Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, you're far more likely to have your case rejected out of hand. If you are a Christian from Afghanistan or Iran, your case is often seen more sympathetically. I don't know about Denmark in particular, but my assumption would be that this desire to limit asylum seekers is a larger trend trying to prevent refugees, asylum seekers, in the sense that people claiming asylum are really illegal immigrants who are creating cases and do not really deserve asylum. And there's a lot of concern about the stories that people tell and who is deserving and who is not. And I think increasingly less generosity for resettlement that we see across most nations at the moment. And may change, but at least in the last 5 years, I think that has been the case. Protests. We have about what is effective and what is not. Oh goodness, I think some of these are one-off. I wouldn't say they're all particularly successful. Most of the people I showed you, in fact, are deported. Most of the people protesting were, in fact, repatriated and deported. But the Vietnamese I write about used multiple strategies. They protested in the camps, they used legal strategies, and they had allies in Hong Kong as well as in the US who took up their legal cases, and they had Vietnamese Americans lobby Congress. And so there are all sorts of strategies that they used. And this is where the Cold War, I think, framework helped the Vietnamese, because the Vietnamese were able to get Republican Congress members to be opposed to repatriation and help them to some ways limit or create other mechanisms that provided for other immigration routes from within Vietnam. And this goes to, in some ways, your question about the Afghanis today. I do not want to be nostalgic about the Cold War. In general, in my work, I'm fairly critical of Cold War politics. But the Cold War did create opportunities for many of these groups to gain sympathy and to get allies in government to make changes, which the Afghanis, I think, in the, quote, war on terror, there are very few in the United States that are able to sort of, I mean, it's part of a larger project, but there's not the same sort of sympathy, right? And so that, I don't think there's like a single sort of formula. Press was another thing that was involved. The key thing was multiple strategies, and even then it had limited efficacy, but Congress, legal, the press, and direct action. All of those were being used. Finally, the Vietnamese government. It's a great question. It's one of, again, the weaknesses of my project. I don't read Vietnamese, and I didn't do any research on the Vietnamese government itself. However, and this is again about the Cold War, the Vietnamese government wanted diplomatic relations with the United States. In the 1980s, the United States had an embargo against Vietnam. The US did not have diplomatic relations with Vietnam. It was much more like Cuba. And the Vietnamese government was authoritarian, but it was a stable state. And it wanted diplomatic relations, and it wanted US economic investment. And so it was willing to make compromises to get US normalization and US economic exchange. And this included these repatriations. And the Vietnamese government said, we will accept, at first they don't want to accept the Vietnamese. They see these as people who want to leave. They don't want them back. But they see this, I would argue, as part of acceptance and as an international, in the international community and with the United States. And so they agreed to accept the Vietnamese repatriates. They also agreed to not persecute them. Now, Vietnamese American activists argued against this. The Vietnamese American activists said, no, there are human rights abuses in Vietnam. Those who are being repatriated are being persecuted. This is wrong to send people back. The UNHCR sent monitors to Vietnam to see what was going on. Vietnamese Americans sent other people as observers. The reports are quite different. The UNHCR said, in fact, people are not being persecuted. Some of the human rights groups said, no, there are examples of persecution. In general, my assessment would be that Vietnamese who returned face the same levels of persecution or limits on their free speech as other Vietnamese in Vietnam. But they were not, in general, singled out. They were not, in general, put in re-education camps like those in 1975 were. And for the most part, they had difficult lives, but they were not persecuted en masse because they were returned. Also part of the 1989 agreement was they went back with money. These were modest amounts. This was another reason why the Vietnamese government saw this as beneficial. It helped bring money to Vietnam. Some of these Vietnamese learned English. This is all anecdotal, but this is a moment when tourism came to Vietnam. Some were able to get jobs in tourist economies. Others were able to go to the United States later through other immigration mechanisms. The US had a few other special programs. One was called the Rover program, one was called the HO program. So there are multiple programs. So I would say that the Vietnamese government saw this as a compromise that it was willing to make for international acceptance and US diplomatic relations more broadly. That doesn't mean that people who went back wanted to or had an easy time, but they were not systematically put in jail.
Thank you, Jana. Then maybe hands up who still wants to ask questions that I know. 1, 2, 3. Now that's perfect. 1, 2, 3. Yes.
Hello. I was wondering, was back then some kind of differentiation between men and women, let's say, for example? Was there a gender dimension to the refugee crisis where they resented or treated differently than, for example, women and children are? Because nowadays, for example, with the crisis in 2015, there was a differentiation made. And now with Ukraine, we see, I mean, for different reasons, women and children leaving. So how was it back then?
It's a good question.
Thank you. And then there were 2. Oh, there's still 3. That's okay.
That's fine. 4 is fine.
So we'll do 4.
Okay. Hi, I'm Zilla. I'm also a MICE2 student here at the Academy. And with regard to your case studies, I couldn't help but notice that you did not talk about the Philippines. And I was wondering, since obviously that would be also a rather practical place to go to the east, especially on the way to Guam, that would be the first stop, and you also said that they were stopping there. But I was wondering how the sentiments in the Philippines, if they were similar to the sentiments in Malaysia and Hong Kong, especially because I would expect that they had sort of the possibility of them letting them pass through on their way to Guam, and if that had some sort of impact on the sentiments in the Philippines.
Great question.
Hello. Yeah, first of all, thank you for your very interesting talk. My name is Aram. I'm also a MS2 student here. You have talked about the willingness of European countries to accept refugees from the Ukraine, which has been also sort of criticized in regards to the willingness of accepting refugees from other places like Syria. And in this regard, the case of Malaysia was really interesting to me, since there was so much animosity towards the refugees of Vietnam. And my question would be if this sentiment has changed with an increasing institutionalization of cooperation between the states in regards to ASEAN, or the formation of a collective identity over time. Yes, thank you.
That's a good question.
And further back, yeah.
Hello, my name is Maria. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question regarding to Cambodian case. You have said that a very large proportion of Vietnamese escaped to Cambodia. And I have a question. There is still those people who are living there on the lake Tonle Sap or something like this. So was there any debate about unrecognized state, or like to give those people civilian rights, those who still live there, but they are like escaped from Vietnam? And another one, additional one, is there a kind of international organization or an NGO that fights for the rights of Vietnamese who still live there?
Vietnamese in Cambodia?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there any urgent need for another question? Because then we would smuggle one more in. Last chance. Okay,
Yeah,
last
go for
chance.
it. I'm taking notes. We're good.
Good.
Thank you very much. My name is Flavio Baroffio. I'm also a MICE2 student here at the DA. I wanted to ask about the refugees then accepted and who were able to relocate to the US or another country. What was their impact on Vietnamese politics? You already hinted that a bit with the money that refugees which were going back to Vietnam, that the Vietnamese government really much appreciated that. So was there maybe influence for remittances or when they traveled back to the country? So what in general was the impact of accepted refugees on Vietnamese politics?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think I have a good answer.
And that was the last one.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, those are really good questions again. Okay, I'm going to go in the order, although, to be honest, my answers for the last group are going to be probably unsatisfying. So first on the question of gender. I think that's a great question. I don't look at gender very much in my work. I again think that's a shortfall of my scholarship. There was not, though, disproportionate numbers of women and children, okay? There were women and children throughout all of the different waves of the Vietnamese, but we never saw larger numbers of women in the same way that I think you're referring to today. I do think there's more research to be done, though, on the gender dynamics. Of what I did find, though, 2 points stuck out. One, I found examples of the asylum hearings. They often, I actually need to be careful with this, but the cases I found, they would often interview just the man or the husband, like the head of the household. And then the assumption was that the family's refugee status might be the same as the head of the household. And that head of the household was often presumed to be male. And so there are a few different times I saw in the archives where someone said, well, what about the woman's case? Like, couldn't we see it as separate? And so I think that there's more research to be done on, in these asylum hearings, was it the whole family? Was it the man? Was it the woman? How did asylum claims get heard? What were the gender dynamics of them? In addition, there's a lot of sexual violence within these camps. There's examples of sexual violence within the camps. There's also a lot of sexual violence on the boat, in the boat escapes or the sea migrants face by pirates who would often stop the boats. And then it became a question, and this might seem academic, but it was a real problem. So that if you were Vietnamese and you're in a boat and then there was sexual assault or rape on the boat, and those women then asked for first asylum in Thailand or in the Philippines or Malaysia, being a rape victim was not necessarily grounds for asylum because they were not being persecuted in their home country. And so it also created this question of what then counted as persecution, and how did sexual violence play into persecution, whether it was in the actual escape or in the camp itself, and should that count as a reason for why someone should get asylum or not. So there's all questions of thinking about gender that need to be examined, and I think that's a place for more research. Another thing that I've heard people talk about is unaccompanied minors today, and the role of unaccompanied minors, particularly I think Afghans who are in Europe right now, and whether they should be deported or repatriated or not. For the Vietnamese unaccompanied minors in the late 80s or early 90s, the UNHCR largely argued that they should be repatriated because that was in the best interest of the child. They should be returned to their families in Vietnam. While activists said, no, what's in the best interest of the child is for them to go to their families in the West. So there are lots of debates about unaccompanied children. And I have a graduate student who's writing about that right now. Okay, Philippines. Who asked about the Philippines? I have 2 chapters on the Philippines. I did not present that work today because I already had too many moving pieces. But you are right, the Philippines play an important role. The Philippines, equally complicated country, large archipelago, very mixed community, Catholic, Muslim, multiple language groups. The Philippines had 2 roles. One acted as a place of first asylum, like Malaysia or Hong Kong, in somewhat smaller numbers because it's farther away geographically, so it took people longer to get there. But it did have about 10, 15,000 people come as first asylum. Those camps tended to be more open. They were less jail-like. The Philippines, it was again on an island that was in the periphery, so they were seen as sort of a little bit out of sight, out of mind, but they were in open camps rather than closed camps. The Philippines also hosted something called the Philippine Refugee Processing Center, which I have not talked about, but it was a very odd camp. I didn't talk about it in 1979, but when we had that 1979 agreement, part of that was also the formation of the Philippine Refugee Processing Center. When Vietnamese were slated for resettlement, they were taken from Malaysia or Hong Kong or from Vietnam directly, and they would first go to the PRPC in the Philippines to learn about America. This is a little odd. Why are they going to the Philippines to learn about America? There are lots of reasons. One is it was cheaper. The idea is you could teach people English, less expensive, in the Philippines. The Philippine government at the time was also the Marcos administration. The Marcos administration was getting attacked by the Carter administration for human rights violations. There was concerns about Marcos' regime on a human rights basis. So the Marcos government said, we'll host this refugee camp. And it was a way to also essentially demonstrate the Philippine government's humanitarian credentials. Imelda Marcos was the head of the refugee camp, the head of the PRPC. So you can also see again, the Philippine domestic politics playing out about why they agreed to host so many of the Vietnamese in the PRPC. Also, the Philippine government was very influenced by the Catholic Church. So unlike Hong Kong and Malaysia that repatriates thousands of people, in the Philippines, only about 81 people are forcibly repatriated. The Catholic Church then steps in. This is again because of activism, because of Vietnamese in the Philippines who are very, very strong and advocating within the church. There's a woman named Sister Pascal, who's a Vietnamese nun in the Philippines, who's very active in the Catholic Bishops' Conference in the Philippines. And the Philippines does not deport other Vietnamese after that one set of repatriation flights. So the Philippines, there's lots going on. I'm happy to talk to you about it later. But we see the dynamics of the domestic politics making huge differences in how the Philippines respond to the refugees. ASEAN and Malaysia, it's a really good question. I don't think I have a great answer for you. ASEAN is clearly developing its own political identity in the 1970s and early 80s. I believe that Malaysia at this point is also trying to defend its own sovereignty, where we see why it's sort of acting in a way that the US and the UK are not interested. And you're right that in many ways this is about ASEAN politics. Malaysia is also trying to determine what its relationship's going to be with Vietnam in the late 1970s. Is Malaysia going to have like positive relationships with Vietnam? And this goes to the next question, which is about Cambodia. A lot of this was about not so much the refugees, but about Vietnam's war with Cambodia and China. So did you have a follow-up or? No, okay. So I mean, and again, I don't think that ASEAN's, I guess I have to look it up again. In my understanding, ASEAN was not having such a strong role in this, although I think it was making statements and one could look at it. But ASEAN and more was trying to figure out how is it going to position itself after the war with the US is over and as Vietnam's wars with Cambodia and China were ongoing. And that was in some ways the dance. And for the most part, ASEAN sides with China over Vietnam in the war with Cambodia. This goes to Cambodia. I don't know anything about the Vietnamese who stayed in Cambodia. Most of the Vietnamese who I know about crossed through, the Cambodians crossed, but this is also, of course, and I'm assuming you know this, Vietnam invades Cambodia in the late 1970s. This is, again, often called the Third Indochina War. The Vietnamese occupation is extremely controversial. It both stops the excesses of violence of the Khmer Rouge, but the United States and most of the world great powers actually support the Khmer Rouge and the Cambodian government against the Vietnamese occupation. So this is very much about those politics, and I don't know about the Vietnamese who end up staying in Cambodia, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards. And finally, about the diasporic politics and the remittances, this is a whole nother realm of study. There's been Vietnamese in the diaspora from before the US war in Vietnam, with the French, you know, there's Vietnamese in France and in other parts of Europe beforehand. But Vietnamese in the diaspora play a large role in Vietnam's economy, particularly after the 1980s and 1990s. I do not know a great deal about contemporary Vietnamese politics, but I think that the economic as well as the diasporic politics very much have influenced Vietnam's 21st century sort of position. But I would refer you to my colleague Eric Harms or my colleague Alison Truitt, who really look at contemporary Vietnam and the role of remittances and circulations of remittances in the global economy in Vietnam.
Good, Jana, then thank you so much for a super interesting talk, for answering lots and lots of questions. We had no online questions, but nevertheless, I'm sure they were very interested. And I think we'll be here informally a little longer, so anyone who didn't want to ask a question now can do so. And thanks a lot, obviously, to you for being here. And Jana, we as DA look forward to the months that are still that you're gonna still be with us.
Thanks
a lot.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. I'm happy to stay and answer any questions one-on-one if people are interested. I'm also teaching a class on refugees next quarter. So for those of you who are interested, I'm teaching a whole semester class. It is not just about my book. It is about refugees in the 20th and 21st century, past and present. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity to the DA and to Fulbright and Fulbright Austria. Thank you. So.